there everyone, I'm Alex. I'm a postgraduate student in creative writing and literary studies, and what you see before you is a recording of a presentation that I gave at the Australasian Association of Writing Programs in Sydney in November of 2019, which, as you may notice, is a little while ago by the time this is actually uploaded. It was on my list of things to do, but kind of fell lower and lower down that priority scale as the new year moved on, as things I want to do in life and in academia especially. Though obviously with recent events, I've been working to digitize a lot of teaching material in terms of lectures and tutorials and assistant stuff. So I figured now that I have my hands on, some actual screen recording knowledge as opposed to screen capping and editing together my presentations, I would throw this one in the mix as well. I know some people expressed interest in it back when it first went out into the world, and I'm quite proud of this one. It's quite fun and ties into the kind of bigger picture of my research. So here it is. I will dive on right into it. If you follow my blog, of course, The Aficionado at WordPress, I'll put a link below. Some of this may be a little bit familiar to you, but if not, hey, you can check on it, click on that plug at the end, and you may find more exciting material of this nature in there. So, why am I here? Why am I talking about trickster gods, etc.? Well, I am midway through a creative thesis in which I'm writing a big mythological fantasy with a trickster character at the heart of its narrative. So to write a trickster and to build a character from scratch that embodies the archetype, I had to get a real handle on what exactly a trickster is. Hence a deep dive into the research and analysis of this character type that I will go into in a moment. And with all that bubbling around in my brain, I began to notice trickster characters in a lot of the media I was consuming. While this character type might originate from mythology, stealing fire from the gods, turning into cows to win bets, and generally bamboozling folks and causing a ruckus, you can also spot evolutions of the trickster in contemporary fiction. The way we conceptualize a trickster might have changed a little over time and with our storytelling methods, but the core of the character and their core appeal is still very much present, and that is what I'm talking about today. So the most famous examples within the study of mythology, where this comes from, of course, are the Norse Loki, the Greek Hermes, or Mercury as he is in the Roman original characters Do Not Steal, the West African Anansi, the Polynesian Maui, and various versions of the archetype that appear in Native American mythology in the form of the coyote, raven, and hare characters. Following on from these, mythologist and structuralist studies, though, have been plenty of questions of what exactly the trickster archetype is now. Many studies of the trickster in myth note that this character type is one that kept occurring in different contexts, across the world and across time, perhaps because there's something about it that we really just intrinsically enjoy and find meaning in. You could say, and plenty of people have, that we need the trickster, and they keep popping up in each new era and mode of storytelling to continually fulfill their cultural narrative function. As with a lot of academic concepts like this, a precise definition of this character type is a little different depending on who you ask. So I'll be drawing from a few key sources and a variety of perspectives therein today, namely these dudes here. So we've got Lewis Hyde's Trickster Makes This World, Mischief, Myth and Art, a book devoted to typifying and identifying trickster characters in mythology. Laurie Landy's Madcaps, Screwballs and Conwomen, the female trickster in American culture, which focuses on the idea of the feminine trickster, drawing from myth but also chiefly focusing on its manifestation in popular culture across the 19th and early 20th centuries. I've got Helena Bassel-Morozo's The Trickster in Contemporary Film and The Trickster and the System, both looking at the evolution of the mythological trickster's traits into contemporary characters and narrative. I've got Terry Waddell's Wild Lives, Trickster, Place and Liminality on Screen, and Mistakes, Archetype, Myth and Identity in Screen Fiction, which look, as their titles imply, at the trickster in film and television. We also have the occasional nod to Michael P. Carroll's very mythy and structuralist papers, The Trickster as Selfish Buffoon and Culture Hero, and Levi Strauss, Freud and the Trickster, A New Perspective on an Old Problem. I'll probably end up shouting out to Jung a couple of times as well, just because he had some interesting things to say about this whole thing, even if he was speaking more about the trickster impulse and the human subconscious rather than typifying characters from stories. So, with all their varied angles of analysis and perspectives on the subject, what, if anything, do these folks agree on? From a review of the literature, I've put together a list of these sorts of things you can generally expect to find in a character we'd call a trickster. These characteristics aren't necessarily all present in every single one, but across the board you'll find some combination of them. Emphasis on trickery and cleverness as dominant traits. Moral ambiguity and self-motivation. They're neither wholly good nor wholly bad, though they may swing in the direction of protagonist or antagonist depending on what happens and how the narrative treats them. Magic and shape-shifting, which can tie into a sort of androgyny or gender fluidity or ambiguity. Contradictions, just as they're kind of good and kind of bad, they're also a mess of paradoxes. The archetypal trickster is a selfish culture hero, a clever fool, a sympathetic bastard, and/or a sacred figure who sometimes does profane things. Liminality. This one's important. Tricksters exist on the fringe, outsiders in the story world in some way. Boundary crossing. Connected to the above point, tricksters have an ability to cross borders, be they social, physical, magical, spiritual, etc. And perhaps most importantly and interestingly to their narrative function, they are, quote, archetypal agents of change. They use their trickery to make a mess of pre-established systems and power structures, whether on a large or small scale, often with a sense of irony or humour in the mix as well. One of my favourite quotes from the trickster in contemporary film is, "Whereas mythological tricksters fight with personified representations of the deterministic principle, Zeus, Thor, Odin, cinematic tricksters attempt to cause socio-political Ragnarok." Let's talk about a perhaps abstract but surprisingly accurate example from children's fiction of a liminal character who goes around and causes socio-political Ragnarok within the dominant power structure of her story world. I'm assuming everyone's at least a little bit familiar with this one, since it's something of a children's classic, both the book and the film. But for a brief rundown, Roald Dahl's Matilda is the story of a young girl in an abusive household who not only is highly intelligent, but develops telekinetic powers, which she ends up using to defeat the ridiculously cruel and overbearing principal of her school, Miss Trunchbull. Matilda obviously leans a little more towards the heroic side of things, and isn't as morally grey or as gross and wacky as some of the other tricksters from myth, owing to her being the protagonist of a children's story. But even with a quick glance, you can see that a lot of these crucial traits are there. First, most importantly, she is a liminal figure sitting outside of the dominant paradigm of power in her story world. Not only is she a child, obviously lacking the agency that adults around her have, but she is actively an outcast within her family for her different way of thinking and behaving. Matilda, again being a small girl, lacks not only social power but physical strength, being metaphorically and literally very small and powerless next to the looming figure of Trunchbull. What Matilda is clever, plus she has that neat psychic magic going on that serves as a kind of manifestation of her mental power. Having been forced outside the social box, she's become very good at thinking outside the box, and it's ultimately this that leads her to triumph over the brute strength of her antagonist. This pattern harks back to the trickster tales from mythology. For example, Anansi the spider, his key antagonist was most often the tiger, a representation of recognizable traditional models of strength and power, towering over the tiny spider but always outdone by the spider's ability to move between the lines and against the grains in a way the tiger did not expect. With Matilda as the spider and Trunchbull as her tiger, you can see the same sort of archetype playing out. Part of what Matilda does in her defeat of Trunchbull is exposing her cowardice and picking holes in the structure of her cruelty, undermining her in a way that only someone coming at the structure of power from a particular marginal angle could do, and doing it with a sense of playful humour too. There's a lot of horror potential in telekinesis, but there's a lot of slapstick too. So speaking of humour and play, my next example might seem a little less classic and sound a little bit silly, but hear me out. Last year now, Australian indie game developer House released a puzzle game called Untitled Goose Game. The premise and tagline informs us that it is a beautiful day in the village and you are a horrible goose. As that implies, the game's player avatar is a white goose who waddles and swims around a quaint English country town, causing havoc, from uprooting vegetables to stealing underwear off washing lines to setting in motion arguments between neighbours, and at one point chasing a child into a phone booth. The whole experience is very fun and gives the audience, here of course playing rather than simply watching or reading this piece of media, a chance to not only observe but to inhabit a contemporary trickster. The goose absolutely works as a representative of trickster characteristics. While the tagline of the game does denote its protagonist as a horrible goose, it would simply be inaccurate to map a system of human morals and ethics onto this non-human character who lives on the fringes of their world, bringing us back to Hyde's important assertion that the trickster is amoral, not immoral. The goose, as an animal in an industrialized setting, ruled by humans, is a liminal figure outside the dominant structure of power, who uses that liminality to think and be and perform outside the box. The goofy goose causes mischief, yes, but the goose is working with the material they have, exposing through their machinations the naturally occurring phrase in the fabric of this power structure, placing events in motion that the humans exacerbate and in the process expose their own folly. The village is a pristine image of human society, all set up just so, and the goose arrives to pick the perfection apart and induce chaos. And once its work is done, the goose returns to his nest, and the game's design loops around and guides you back to where the story began. And this fulfills Basil Moroz's assertion that tricksters ought to vanish from the narrative once they've completed their work as that archetypal agent of change. As the ending of the game also implies, when we see a large collection of treasure that the goose has brought home, the goose has done this before, and surely will do so again, when they next feel the impulse to ruffle some feathers. Again, that might sound a little silly, but we all have a silly streak. In fact, Carl Jung and others following him have called this the inner trickster, which you could safely argue the goose is merely inviting us to bring to the surface. So, while we're talking about tricksters in popular culture, I would be remiss not to mention specifically Laurie Landay's theory of the feminine trickster. Landay names the archetypal lady trickster as Scheherazade, the narrator from 1001 Arabian Nights, who uses a combination of her cleverness and the typically feminine skill of speech to save her own life and get herself out of her powerless, marginal position. Tracking novels and films from the 19th and 20th centuries, Landay explores the idea of the liminal, playful, troublemaking trickster as a feminine figure. The lady trickster, she argues, has all those traits we've come to expect, but puts a particular spin on them. Women are, after all, intrinsically liminal and outside the dominant paradigm of power in a patriarchal society. There are also a host of social expectations and stereotypes that cling to women, which Landay defines the female trickster will use to her advantage. This is particularly true of the con women part of her book's title, Madcaps, Screwballs and Con Women, which is why I have an image from last year's The Hustle up there. The movie is a retelling of sorts of Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, with two of the female leads instead of two male leads as it was originally. Those Scoundrels also features an example of the kind of character Landay's talking about. The story follows two con men trying to bamboozle a seemingly kind, slightly vapid woman out of her fortune, only to discover in the end that she's a con artist herself and has been playing the boys off each other the entire time. The Hustle's main characters play into that similar sense of deliberately subverted expectations. There is a scene where Anne Hathaway's character steals an expensive diamond bracelet from a man who's trying to impress her with it. Hathaway knows the jewel's value, but plays herself up as a ditzy rich girl who says, "I like it 'cause it's shiny," and then covertly nicks the bracelet and replaces it with another one while her target is distracted. Naturally, the con woman has constructed herself in such a way that plays into all his expectations and stereotypes about certain kinds of women, in a way that deliberately gets his guard down. That playful tongue-in-cheek humour of the trickster is very important here, not only in the fact that obviously the movie is a cheesy comedy, but in the trickster's inherent playfulness and willingness to essentially take the piss out of the dominant power structure and steal power for themselves in the process. When it comes to Landay's feminine trickster, shape-shifting is often a big part of his characters, harking back to our mythical origins, but often in a less literal way. The shape-shifting in these characters is more likely embodied as a repertoire of code switching and strategic changes in appearance and behaviour to suit the situation at hand. Villanelle, the assassin from the BBC America drama Killing Eve, is one of many neat examples of this. She is a hired killer with a real ruthless streak, but she knows exactly when to downplay this and how. Villanelle is in her mid-20s, but can shift her appearance, mannerisms, and pattern of speech just so that she appears much younger and thus much more vulnerable, using this as a method to garner sympathy from people she is trying to manipulate. She can also just as easily switch between a whole folder of alternate personas, not always, but often tying into that idea of Landay's that the lady trickster plays on stereotypes and expectations of women to bamboozle their, often male, targets. Villanelle can play cute terrifyingly well for someone who the audience knows can and will murder someone with expert precision. All this might sound like she ought to be the show's antagonist, but the narrative positions her as something more like the secondary protagonist, among a main cast of women on a sliding spectrum of grey morality. As the story continues and the audience learns ever more about Villanelle and she shifts more and more away from her role as villain, her trickster traits and her trickster function become more and more prominent. She's a liminal figure caught between systems of power. She operates by her own moral code, and she induces chaos and change into the life of the show's main character, Eve. Like those con women I mentioned before, her moral ambiguity and place outside the box, as it were, is a crucial part of her character and of her character's playful appeal. So these are only a handful, and I could go on. There's not one particular source I can find who coined it first. There's a particular popular conception of Bugs Bunny as a great archetypal trickster, a liminal troublemaker who bends the laws of physics and takes the mickey out of the laws of human society to undermine its power structures, often represented by hunters or other typically strong characters. Given Bugs Bunny's penchant for cross-dressing, pictured, he also falls perfectly into the point about shape-shifting and its relation to gender fluidity. If you wanted to, you could also talk about Marvel's Deadpool as a trickster for his role as a profane hero who breaks boundaries by breaking the fourth wall. You could talk about the dimension-hopping characters Michael and Janet from Netflix's The Good Place, for how they work to undermine the flaws in their system of celestial bureaucracy, helping human souls while also fundamentally existing outside of a human code of ethics and understanding. A side note, ladies, gentlemen, and distinguished guests, at the time of presentation I put up that picture of Michael and a massive clap of thunder went off. It was a great and atmospheric part of the presentation and I'm sorry you all missed it. Spooked the bejesus out of me. In any case, of course, we could talk as well about the new interpretations of trickster characters from myth and how they've evolved to suit newer conceptions and needs of the archetype, like Odin as he appears in Neil Gaiman's American Gods. Ironically, though, you possibly can't talk about maybe the current most famous trickster adaptation, Marvel's Loki, because according to Basil Morozzo, he's been too Disney-fied and is no longer nasty or gnarly enough to actually be recognizable as himself, which is unfortunate, but also pretty funny. So I hope what I've gotten across today is that the trickster is a fun, fascinating, bizarre character type who can take all sorts of different forms for different purposes. Naturally enough, it contains multitudes. You can find these tricky fellows in the stories we tell right through history, shifting, appropriately, with the times and with our needs, and speaking deeply to the playful, ruckus-causing, change-craving impulse in all of us. To finish with a quote from Helen Locke, it is not hard to account for the trickster's appeal. They are fun, for one important thing, in their anarchic assault on the status quo, although their trickery also strikes a deeper human chord. And that brings us to our conclusion. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you learned something. All my details are below, and stay safe.